Early Egypt. In the early Stone Age, people in Egypt lived high up on the land above the Nile. By about 5000 BCE, they had become farmers, growing wheat and barley and raising cattle. They also built villages of mud huts in parts of the floodplain. The farmers prospered and started to form kingdoms. Recent evacuation shows that by 3500 BCE, people were already living in cities and had started to invent systems of writing. Objects found in brick-lined graves, such as beautifully carved ivories, slate palettes, and clay pots revealing fascinating details of life in Egypt before the pharaohs came to power in circa 3100 BCE. Mace head. Mace heads were usually used as weapons. This smooth, superbly carved example was probably designed for ceremonial occasions. Comb and companion. The African elephant and hippo provided plenty of ivory for early craft workers. The figure with the striking eyes was placed in a tomb to provide the owner with a companion in the afterlife. Ancient body. Before mummification, bodies were buried in a sleeping position in a sandy pit. The sand dried and preserved the body so that a person's spirit would be able to recognize it. This man died about 5,000 years ago. His features and ginger hair have been fairly well preserved. Food containers useful in the afterlife. Skin well preserved because body was dried out by sand. Ginger hair. Necklaces. Early jewelers used semi-precious stones from the deserts such as feldspar or green and carnelian or orange. These early craft workers were valued members of society and were well rewarded. Feldspar, carnelian. Stone vase. This vase was carved from a mottled stone called breccia, using copper or flint tools. Smooth shape made by simple tools. Pottery vase. Nile silt and clay from the edges of the floodplain provided materials for the early potters. This pot's tapering base was designed to fit in a stand or in a hollow in the ground. Eye inlaid with ivory. Spiral design. Cosmetic palette. Some of the earliest surviving Egyptian objects are slate palettes. They could be rectangular or carved in animal shapes such as hippos, turtles, falcons, or this obese ram. The surface was used for grinding minerals for eye paint. See page 58. Famous pharaohs. From circa 3100 BCE, Egypt was ruled by powerful kings known as pharaohs. The title pharaoh comes from the words pera, meaning great house, which refers to the king's palace. The pharaoh was believed to be a living god and his queen was a goddess, although she was usually given the title of great royal wife. Only rarely did women rule Egypt in their own right. On the king's death, the throne passed to his son, who would be specially trained in sports and warfare to prepare him for the role. Princes sometimes had to wait a long time to take power. One pharaoh, Pepi II, came to throne at the age of 6. He was still king 94 years later. The oval enclosing the hieroglyphs that spell out a pharaoh's name is called a cartouche. Armless queen. This statue shows a queen of Egypt from circa 700 BCE. The statue's arms have been lost. Osiris, god of the underworld. Akhenaten. Nefertiti. Hatshepsut. Queen Hatshepsut above ruled Egypt for about 20 years. She was supposed to be ruling on behalf of her young stepson, but declared herself pharaoh in 1473 BCE. Akhenaten and Nefertiti. In Akhenaten's reign, the traditional Egyptian gods were banished. Only the sun god Aten was worshipped. Akhenaten, who ruled with his wife Nefertiti, founded a new capital city and closed the temples of the other gods. After their death, their names became hated and their temples were destroyed. Eventually, the old gods were restored by Tutankhamun. Sphinxes. In ancient Egypt, the Sphinx was a mythological creature with a lion's body and the head of a ruler. Lions were associated with the sun god, and their strength represented the pharaoh's power. Sometimes sphinxes combined other elements, such as the head and wings of a hawk, which symbolized the god Horus. Monumental statues of sphinxes were often placed in front of tombs to guard the pharaoh in the afterlife. Sphinx at Giza. The Sphinx was carved around 4,500 years ago for the pharaoh Khafre. In control. This ivory statuette shows a sphinx representing the pharaoh's power. Ceremonial beard. Cobra goddess. Headcloth. Ramesses the Great. In the 13th century BCE, Ramesses II reigned for 67 years. He built a vast number of monuments, including a temple at Thebes, now called the Ramesseum. The statue shows him wearing a royal headcloth called the Nemes, under a crown of cobras. Jar of sacred liquid. Thutmose IV. This king was famous for clearing the sand that had buried the Great Sphinx at Giza. He is shown holding jars of sacred liquid and wearing a headcloth featuring the cobra goddess Wadjet. It was believed that Wadjet protected the pharaoh by spitting fire at his enemies. Tutankhamun. This ruler came to the throne at the age of 9. He was determined to bring back the old gods who had been banished by Akhenaten. See left. This famous gold mask was found in his tomb. See page 23. Royal court. At great state occasions, such as jubilee celebrations or the presentation of gifts to favored courtiers, the king and the court gathered together, and top officials, diplomats, and high priests would attend. Some courtiers were relatives of the king. Others were high-ranking army officers or head scribes. Pharaohs were all-powerful and commanded great respect. When people approached the king, they would often kiss the ground beneath his feet. Royal head. This glass portrait probably decorated an item of furniture or a window. Fishes. Egyptian children often wore fish-shaped amulets in their hair. Amulet case. Protective amulets could be put in a case and hung from a necklace. Oyster pendant. Early Egyptian jewelry was often made of shells. Later, jewelers copied these shapes in gold. Royal throne. Queen Hetepheres was the mother of King Khufu. See page 20. Her court throne was made of wood overlaid with gold leaf. Insects ate the wood away, but archaeologists were able to reconstruct the furniture. Lion's paw leg. Throw stick. Courtiers used wooden throw sticks to catch birds. This one, made of brittle fans, see page 47, was a ceremonial throw stick. It bears the name of the pharaoh Akhenaten. Royal vases. The pharaohs used the best quality utensils, which were buried in their tombs for use in the next world. These 2 carved stone vases have gold lids adorned with imitation twine, also in gold. They were made for King Khasikhemwy. Eye of Horus, see page 24, meant to indicate the object's good condition. Name of King Akhenaten. God of millions of years holding branches in his hands. Bouquet, dog-headed scepter. Sign of life. Only gods, kings, and queens were allowed to carry the ankh, the Egyptian symbol of life. It indicates that the holder has the power to give life or take it away. Noblewoman. Wives of great officials held high statues at court. They often formed themselves into a group called a guild, protected by the goddess Hathor. This woman wears a heavy wig adorned with a circle of flowers. Pillar of the god Osiris. Finely pleated dress. Pharaoh. This gold figurine shows the royal crown decorated with the cobra goddess and the crook and flail, which represent kingship. Lotus tile. This tile comes from a piece of furniture in King Akhenaten's palace. Surviving fragments like this give us an idea of the splendor of the royal courts. Lotus design. Mummies. The Egyptians believed in an afterlife where they would be reborn in their original bodies. For this to happen, the body had to be preserved by mummifying it. The inner organs were removed, dried, and stored in vessels called canopic jars. The heart was left behind so that it could be weighed in the afterlife. See page 19. Then the body was dried with natron salt and wrapped in linen bandages. A scarab was placed over a king's heart to protect him in the underworld. Anubis. The god Anubis was responsible for embalming. Here he puts the final touches on a mummified body. Wax plate. Plates like this one, decorated with the eye of Horus, see page 24, were used to cover cuts made in the flesh of the corpse. Opening the mouth utensils. One of the most important of all funerary rites, this ceremony was thought to bring a mummy to life, allowing it to eat, drink, and move. This model kit contains some of the instruments for the ceremony, including vases and cups of the sacred liquids and a forked instrument for touching the mouth. Instrument for touching the mouth, vase. Ritual and spell. Priests scattered purified water and touched the mouth of the upright mummy case with the ritual instruments. The eldest son burns incense and a spell is recited. Canopic jars. These special containers were meant to protect the organs from spells. The intestines, stomach, liver, and lungs were each placed in a separate jar. Mummy labels. Small wooden tags were used to identify mummies. Anubis is shown in black on the left. Black was a symbol of life in Egypt because it was the color of the fertile Nile mud. Inside a mummy. An X-ray reveals the stuffing that replaces the organs. Natron. Natron salt was used to dry out the corpse. The crystals were packed around the body, and within 40 days it would have dried out and no further decay would take place. It was then ready for bandaging. Ancient linen wrapping. Unwrapped. This mummy shows how well the natron has preserved the body, even the toenails are intact. Everlasting bodies. The final stage in the embalming process was to put the body in its coffin. Wealthy people often had elaborate coffins made up of several decorative layers. The Egyptians believed that two important spirits lived on after a person's death. The most important was the Ka, which would bring the corpse back to life. Another spirit that lived on after death was a person's Ba, which was represented by a hawk with a human head. The process of mummification was intended to make a body last forever and to provide the Ka with a home in the afterlife. Ramesses III. The body of Ramesses III, who ruled over Egypt in the 12th century BCE, shows his eyes packed with linen and his arms still positioned as if holding the crook and flail scepters. See page 13. Hand and arm from an Egyptian mummy. Mummy case. Once it was wrapped in linen bandages, the body was free from decay. The interior of the coffin would be richly decorated with images of gods, while the outside would be adorned with colorful hieroglyphs of spells destined to help the dead person in the kingdom of Osiris, god of the underworld. Idealized portrait of the deceased. Red straps usually indicate a member of the priesthood. Sun disk, sky goddess nut, falcon. Spells written in hieroglyphs. Linen protects body. Mummified head. This is what a mummy looks like when the linen layers are peeled back. The technique of embalming used in ancient Egypt was remarkable, but it made the flesh look withered and discolored. The eyes were destroyed by the natron, so pads of linen were put in the eye sockets and the lids were closed over these. The nose could also be damaged as a result of pressure from the linen wrappings. The linen often stuck to the skin because of the oils applied to the body. Eyes stuffed with linen pads. Linen wrappings still sticking to skin. Damage to the nose, perhaps caused by tight wrappings. Teeth with worn caps because of coarse Egyptian bread. See page 48. Afterlife. The ancient Egyptians believed that below the earth there was an underworld called Duat, a place full of dangers, such as fiery lakes and poisonous snakes. To protect against these perils, spells are written on coffins or on ornate papyrus scrolls. If you could recite the correct spells, you would be able to pass through Duat unharmed. The ultimate danger was to fail the test set in the Hall of the Two Truths, where your heart was weighed against your past deeds. If you passed the test, you could go through a land that was just like Egypt itself. Outspread arms show the god's power extended beyond its own body. Hired mourners. Women were sometimes hired to weep at funerals, since the number of mourners reflected the status of the deceased. Ram-headed god statue covered in black resin. Ram-headed god. Sometimes statues of the underworld gods were taken into tombs of the Valley of the Kings. See page 22. They were meant to protect the king as he traveled through the underworld. These gods had heads of creatures such as tortoises, hippos, or rams. Weighing the heart. Here, the heart of the dead man is placed on the scales to be weighed against the feather of truth. If his heart weighs less than the feather, he can go to the kingdom of Osiris and be reborn. If his heart is heavier than the feather, it means that he is evil or untruthful. His heart will then be fed to the goddess Amut, the devourer of the dead, and he will not survive into the afterlife. Thoth, the god of wisdom, records the result. Dead man, Anubis, jackal-headed god of mummification, devourer of the dead. Thoth, ibis-headed god of wisdom, with scribe's palate. Horus, falcon-headed sky god. Osiris, god of the underworld. Goddesses, Nephthys in white, and Isis. Mourner, mummy. Funerary barge. Mummies traveled to the underworld on a funerary barge with two female shaven-headed mourners. These women were called the two kites and represented the goddesses Isis and Nephthys. A sailor sits at the stern with two large oars. The color, green, on the side of the boat, the color of unripened crops, symbolizes resurrection in the afterlife. Deceased worshipping the sons of Horus. Model servants. Important Egyptians such as pharaohs and priests were often buried with model figures of servants called shaptis. If the god Osiris needed manual work doing in the underworld, it was thought that the shaptis would come to life and perform the tasks for their masters. The pyramids. The first pyramid was built as the tomb of King Djoser in circa 2650 BCE. by his architect Imhotep, see page 34. Called the Step Pyramid, it rose in 6 stages and was designed as a gigantic stairway to the sun god in the sky. Pyramids with sloping sides were built during the reign of King Seneferu to represent the mound on which the sun god stood at the beginning of time. The largest pyramid is the Great Pyramid at Giza, built for King Khufu in circa 2589 BCE. The pyramids were built to protect the bodies and treasures of the pharaohs and had granite doors and false passages to deter thieves. But by circa 1000 BCE, almost all of the pyramids had been robbed. Climbers. In the 19th century, many visitors climbed the Great Pyramid to admire the view below. Today, it is illegal to climb the pyramids in Egypt. Grand Gallery. This gallery, 154 foot or 47 meters long and 28 feet or 8.5 meters high, rises toward the burial chamber. Its magnificent roof is built of stone. After the burial, great blocks of granite were lowered down the slope to seal off the chamber. The Great Pyramid. Built for King Khufu around 4,500 years ago, the Great Pyramid was one of the 7 wonders of the world. It took about 20 years to build and contains over 2.3 million limestone blocks ranging from 2.5 to 16.5 tons, 2.5 to 15 metric tons in weight. The builders may have used levers to get the stones into place, but had no pulleys or other machinery. Every year, field workers joined the workforce for 3 months during the Nile flood. The complex also contained a mortuary temple for the offerings and a causeway leading to the Valley Temple where the king's body was received after its last journey along the Nile. Small pyramids, the burial places of the 3 chief wives of Khufu. Mortuary temple, where offerings could be made. Causeway connecting pyramid to temple in Nile Valley. How high? At 481 feet, or 147 meters, the Great Pyramid was taller than the Arc de Triomphe, the Statue of Liberty, and St. Paul's Cathedral. Capstones. Inside the pyramid. This model shows the interior of the Great Pyramid. The original limestone casing was stripped away in the Middle Ages. The lowest chamber may have been the original burial chamber, or could have been built to confuse tomb robbers. The central room may be another abandoned burial chamber. Above the room where Khufu was finally buried are 5 cavities designed to spread the weight of the stones above. Tora limestone casing. Chambers to relieve weight from above. Local limestone core. King's Chamber. Grand Gallery. Abandoned burial chamber. Escape shaft. Granite seal. Entrance covered by casing. Desert bedrock. Original burial chamber. Pit for boat to carry king's body up the Nile River. The Valley of the Kings. The Pyramid Age came to an end in circa 2150 BCE. Nearly all the pharaohs from Thutmose I, 1504 BCE to Ramesses XI, 1070 BCE, chose to be buried in tombs in the Valley of the Kings, which lay deep in the cliffs west of the Nile. The narrow entrance to the valley could be guarded, and some tombs were hidden high in the cliffs. Tombs usually had a deep corridor known as the Way of the Sun God, which had a well near the inner end to catch rainwater and to deter tomb robbers. Beyond this was the Hall of Gold, where the king would be buried, surrounded by gilded furniture, jewelry, royal clothing, and other treasures. Ramesses VI. The king, who died in 1136 BCE, was buried in a granite coffin that weighed many tons. Underworld deity. This hippo-headed god was found in the tomb of Thutmose III. It is covered in black resin because black was the color of life in ancient Egypt. It probably represented a guardian of the house of Osiris, god of the underworld. Sacred serpent. The Valley of the Kings was thought to be protected by the cobra goddess Meretseger. Tomb workers believed that she had the power to blind or poison liars and criminals. Valley view. This paint of the Valley of the Kings by 19th century artist David Roberts shows a quiet, remote place. Today, it is much busier than a modern road parking lot and souvenir stalls. Foreman and his son. Foreman, like Anarchao, shown here with his son, were responsible for organizing the workflow in the tomb and making sure that the workers had the correct tools. This picture of Anarchao comes from his own colorfully painted tomb. Unknown king. The statue of this unknown king was found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. The monarch wears the red crown, showing authority over Lower Egypt, and holds the royal crook and flail. Deir el-Medina. These stone foundations belong to the village where the tomb workers lived. Founded in the 16th century BCE, it flourished for 500 years. Usually about 60 families lived in these houses at any one time. All dressed up. The contents of Tutankhamun's tomb were transported to Cairo Museum. Here, Archaeologists Lord Carnarvon and Howard Carter were wrapping one of the guardian statues from the tomb. Tutankhamun. The tomb of Tutankhamun was the only one in the valley to escape almost untouched by robbers. Discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, it was the last valley tomb to be found. It contains weapons, furniture, jewelry, and model boats, as well as the king's famous coffins and masks. See page 11. Many of these items were made of solid gold or were richly decorated with gold leaf. The king was buried with his 2 stillborn daughters and a lock of his grandmother's hair.